the tribulation, depart from me, ye cursed, into everlasting fire prepared for the devil and his angels. So we see in this verse here, it talks about everlasting fire. And then as I come through this lesson today, you'll see about eternal judgment goes right along. Matter of fact, the word everlasting and the word eternal are the same in the text. They mean the same. It's the same word, but it's translated one time everlasting, another time eternal. But do you believe in everlasting punishment? Jesus did. Jesus is the one that mentions this. Do you believe it's a literal place of fire and torment? Well, Jesus did. When we think of the most descriptive passage on hell, we look at Luke chapter 16 of the rich man that was in hell. And it was Jesus, the one that told the story. I don't believe it was a parable. I think it was a true story that Lazarus died and was in Abraham's bosom, and the rich man died and was in a literal place of punishment. It was Jesus that said that. People talk about they don't want to hear about hell, but do you know that Jesus spoke more about hell than any other person in the Bible? More about hell personally than anyone else in the Bible. Jesus says, what would it profit a man to gain the whole world and lose his own soul? There's many words that are translated from hell. The word Sheol is used in the Old Testament. It's a Hebrew word meaning the place of the dead. It's translated hell and it's translated grave. And you say, why is it translated both? Because sometimes it's talking about the physical body that goes in the grave. And so it's not translated hell, it's translated grave. It's a place of the dead where the body is placed in the grave. But it's also translated hell, referring to that soul or that spirit that continues on in a place of judgment separated from God. When we think about hell, hell is a temporary place until the final judgment when the dead is brought out of hell, the spirit is brought out of hell and is judged, and they are cast into the lake of fire. That is the final judgment of the unbeliever. Just like when we die, we go to paradise, and after the resurrection, we are with Jesus in heaven. That is our permanent abode. So I try to keep up on everything on the religious side, and I know I've mentioned before about the Pew Research on different subjects. And you say, what is that? That is supposed to be a Christian organization. The Pew, here's the Pew, and their view of, they'll take surveys on different doctrines and different subjects of what the people now believe about a certain subject. A Pew survey of 6,485 American adults, including 1,421 evangelicals, was taken in September 2021. The subject was this, excuse me, the afterlife. What do people believe about the afterlife? 73% said they believe in heaven. You think that made them saved? You know, there's a lot of religious people that are not saved. You know, they might say, well, my family, I've heard about heaven, and I try to live a good life, and they think because they believe in heaven in a general sense that's enough. That's not enough. You've got to believe in the one that is in heaven, the one that came to earth and died for your sins and went back to heaven. That's why you're going to heaven, not because of what you did, even not because of what you believe in that sense of saying, well, I believe there must be a heaven. I mean, there must be something more than this. That's not going to get you to heaven. Because Jesus came and died as a man, and because Jesus overcame death and the grave, that's why, because he lives, we shall live also. If you don't believe that Jesus rose from the grave, you're certainly not going to be raised from the grave. You must believe, you must have faith that what Christ did was personally for you, and you can have that power, you can be that overcomer over death, and that you have an inheritance because you are in the family of God. Survey, 73% believe in heaven, 62% believe in hell. This is the general public. I don't know whether this was a telephone survey or what kind of survey. And 25% said they don't believe in either. You know, it's hard to believe, for me to believe. I've heard about God all my life, from a child up, and I thought everybody believed in God. Have you talked to anybody that says, I don't believe in anything? It's really strange. People usually won't admit that, but when you're talking to them and try to witness to them, and you get down and you try to come to the point, do you believe in God? And they might say, I don't believe in anything. I don't believe in God. I don't believe in the afterlife. Here, 25% said they don't believe in anything. And 7% said they believed in a different kind of afterlife. A different kind. What kind would that be? What would be a different kind of afterlife other than going to heaven, other than being resurrected and being with Jesus? What kind of other afterlife would somebody believe in? I can tell you, reincarnation. Reincarnation, that they're going to come back as somebody else. Emma has a story about when she was in the hospital one time for her back, and a nurse come in, and she jingled when she come in, and Emma says, what's that noise? She says, I have this little anklet here, and I have bells on it. She says, why do you have the bells on it? He said, I don't want to step on any ants, because some of those ants may be that they have been reincarnated. They come back as an ant. Can you believe that? Does that sound stupid? People have all kinds of belief about afterlife. Here's something that we live with every day in our culture, in our elections. This is not my survey. This is the Pew survey. 85% of Republicans are more likely than Democrats to believe in heaven and hell. I'm sure it's not always been that way, but it's that way now. 85% of the Republicans believe in heaven and hell. 65% of Democrats believe in heaven and hell. Talk about a division. We have such division in our country now over everything, over race, over religion, just about over anything. And this is really dividing our country, just like the North and the South and the Civil War and everything that goes with it. So this is the society that we lived in. Survey. When we take the Bible and read something, it is something for our benefit. It is something for us to believe. It's not something to debate in the sense, well, we're going to take a consensus of how many people believe in heaven and how many people believe in hell. God doesn't work that way. God has said it. Jesus has overcome it. The Bible is not a survey. It's not a consensus that people come and say, well, we'll decide what we want to believe, and now the church is going to believe this way, although the traditional way is this way, but now we're going to take a consensus, a majority vote. Either you believe what this Bible says, or you don't believe it at all. You can't choose and pick in the sense of, well, I don't think God is just in sending someone to hell. Let God be God. You know, God is true. He is a God of truth. He is not going to make a mistake. Yet people sort of judge God like, hey, I think I could do this better if I was God. God is permitting all this sin, of course, for a season. But do you get the idea that man wants to really be his own God? He's been that way from the beginning. And that he wants to take control of things. Heaven and hell. Hell is a literal place. And why don't we hear too much about hell? Because of civil rights now, because of hate speech, all kinds of reasons. Because the Bibles, the new translations, take hell out of the Bible. It's not even in there. They, instead of translating that Hebrew word Sheol, they'll just put Sheol down there in the Old Testament. Instead of translating that Greek word Hades into hell, they just put Hades. I can remember back in the 60s, the first time I ever seen a Bible that said Hades. And I said, what is that? And I was told and explained that that was hell. And so I started questioning why these Bibles had changed it and dropped it. But now we have the New King James. I have a chart on all the changes in the Bible. But even in the King James Bible has 54 instances of the word hell. 31 times in the Old Testament, and 12 times used by Jesus in the sense of a Gehenna being hell, one time there in 2 Peter. So hell is translated 31 times in the Old Testament and 23 times in the New Testament. New King James, they have it 32 times instead of 54 times. Instead of having it 31 times in the Old Testament, they have 19. Instead in the New Testament, they have it 13. Hell is missing 22 times in the New King James Bible. And you say, how do they do that? They're supposed to be using the same text as the King James. Because they use a different method of translation instead of a literal word-for-word translation, it is a thought-for-thought translation, and so they just change it at will, even though they're using the same text. So everlasting fire, everlasting torment, everlasting destruction, eternal damnation, eternal judgment, eternal fire. Matthew 25:46, and these shall go into everlasting punishment, but the righteous into life eternal. Hellfire, it's mentioned again and again. Questions about hell? Where is it? In the Old Testament, we see it's in the earth, down in the earth. What happens to the earth? In 1 Peter, it talks about the earth that's going to burn up and everything in it. But it talks about hell. The ones in hell are going to be brought out of hell, and they're going to be judged and cast into the lake of fire. I know there's a lot of things to talk about when we talk about hell. As a child and even as an adult, I bet you thought that the devil was in hell now. Was you taught after you was a Christian, and did you think that the devil is in hell? The devil has never been in hell, but he will be. The Antichrist and the false prophet are going to be cast into the lake of fire, And 1,000 years later, Satan himself is going to join the Antichrist and the false prophet who are still in the lake of fire, and they're going to be tormented day and night forever and ever. And all the ones that have not been saved, that are not written in the Lamb's Book of Life, they also will be cast into that lake of fire. So hell, it's not hate speech. Today, they're going to be judging, talking about hell just like they'll be talking about civil rights. Pastor, I'm out of time, overtime. But come and get us going here on the mission conference. Big time of year.
Yes, it is. Well, thank you, Brother Mike. Good to have you back today. All right. Let me make a couple of prayer requests, and we'll have some ushers come, and we'll receive an offering this morning. And just remind you of a few folks that we need to pray for. Miami Valley, we have Wilma Kastner, Jack Snell, Don Jones, and Wayne Burke, who is in his new addition to Miami Valley Hospital. Also, want you to pray for Shelley Holloway. Shelley was in the hospital this week and had a mass behind her tongue, a large mass. They took biopsy of that, and at this point, the biopsy, haven't heard any negative news about the biopsy, and they was able to remove some of that mass. She was having a problem swallowing. She's a Down syndrome lady, so I think it's kind of normal that they maybe have a larger tongue or whatever, but it was really to the point where she was having a problem swallowing. But she's come through that, and so she's recovering at home, and so please pray for her sisters who look after her, especially her sister Brenda. She lives with her sister Brenda, so please pray for them if you would. See who else I put down there. Bob Hunter, one of our men, undergoing some treatments this time. Also Dell Smith, Cliff Swords, and haven't heard anything more about my grandson Bo. He has an infection, an abscess. They did biopsy it. There's nothing malignant about that, but they still haven't determined what's causing it and what next step to take. So please, we'll try to find out more about that. I'll let you know as soon as I find out more about that. All right. Well, let's ask God to bless in our offering. Did you look over the bulletin somewhat, Brother Mike? Good. Okay. Well, we have the...
Also, I want to ask, pray for my daughter-in-law. She started her chemo treatment for cancer of the liver.
Okay.
So, Connie Dooley.
Connie Dooley. Okay.
Yeah.
Daughter-in-law Connie Dooley, cancer of the liver. We'll write this down real quick. If you have a prayer request that you would like to add on our prayer list, if you'll write it down on the back of an offering envelope, and we will add that to our prayer list. Missionary family, this is the second brochure that our second bulletin has one of our missionary families, so try to keep them. This was last week's, this is this week's. The Stanchek family, I'm going to think, I don't know if that's exactly how you pronounce it, we'll find out for sure. The Stanzak, maybe, family. Aviation missionaries, and what is an aviation missionary? We'll read the back of the bulletin there to kind of tell you some information about what God has called them to do to be able to get the gospel into the world. So it's a good prayer letter. All right. Lord, thank you today for the opportunity to be in the Lord's house, and thank you for these folks that are here for our time of Bible study. Pray your blessings upon it. Bless this offering, we pray in Christ's name. Amen. All right. Brother Amos, there you go. God bless you. All right. Well, we will start for a few weeks leading up to our mission conference, and we'll begin to talk about our Faith Promise program. One of the most, I got some guys coming here, Brother Mike. Thank you, Brother Mike. Here. Get somebody to help you. You guys got them. Donald always wants two of them. Saving them for what's her name? Oh, your friend. She's probably watching this. So she's down in Florida. She's watching this on And so you called her, what's call it, my friend. You may be in big trouble, boy. So you'll be careful. All right, those of you watching live stream, we're going to be in 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and 9. And give a little handout sheet this morning with a few fill-in-the-blanks. And we're going to talk about this matter of missions. And here at Cornerstone for many, many years, we have practiced faith promise missions. I told them Wednesday night how that I first came acquainted with faith promise missions. Since I came to this church when I was 17 years old, I think I was 17, maybe 16. I always had a mission emphasis, but in about 1960, early 60s sometime, maybe 64, 65, something like that, Pastor Fleming announced that we were having a special guest come in, and we were going to have a special conference on missions. And I'm not sure if the name was called Faith Promise Missions at that time, but the gentleman came, a pastor that came from Ontario, Canada, and his name, if I could just remember his name, Oswald J. Smith. And Oswald J. Smith had written several books, and his church had begun to practice something that he called Faith Promise Missions. And it was taken from the Bible, from 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and chapter 9. And so he came and began to explain this program of giving. It's not giving of the tithes and offerings, but giving to help the gospel around the world, helping believers. You see, when we give to missionaries, sometimes, we're going to all the world to preach the gospel to every creature, but the commission is not only to win people to Christ, but it's also to train the converts. So a missionary, when they go to the field, their desire, first of all, is to give out the gospel and win some folks to the Lord and train them. So the money we give not only is seeing people saved, but it's seeing people trained in the things of the Lord, so that they can establish a church, and that when the missionary is gone, the church will continue on. That's indigenous missions, where churches are planted and they survived by the national people who take control. God raises up leadership in the national people to continue the church. So here in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, if you'll look at your outline, I give you a little introductory remark concerning this lesson today from 2 Corinthians 8 and 9. The faith promise offering, what is it? Well, it's biblically based. It's a biblical method of giving by individuals through the local church. I believe all of our giving should be through the local church. That's what I practice. I practice giving through the local church, and I believe that's God's way. If I would send money to a missionary myself, then he would receive that money, and he would want to praise me for giving him that money. But when I send it to him, and through the offering plate, and it comes to him from Cornerstone Baptist Temple, then he gives the Lord's church the thanks for that, and he sees it as coming from the Lord. So it's Faith Promise Missions is biblical method of giving to get the gospel to the world and keeping the gospel going in the world through the local church, and it's to support home and worldwide mission. See, mission work is not just across the sea, it's across the street. It begins in Acts chapter 1, you're familiar with that. You shall be witnesses unto me in Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria and unto the uttermost parts. So at the same time, we have a responsibility in Dayton, Ohio. If you look at that map up there, we haven't had, if anybody would like to take on a project, I'll give you a project. Now this board flips down, and you can, it'll come down, it'll flip down its own hinges. But we haven't put new lights on that board in forever because it's a real project. And there's probably some lights, if we look real close, there's probably some lights that are burnt out. But that brightest light, if you'll see in the United States, that bright light, that's to represent Cornerstone Baptist Temple. And so if that light goes out, if that big light goes out, the rest of them go out, as far as we're concerned. So we have to keep the big light shining, because that's from the big light, that's where all the others are receiving support. Now, of these missionaries that we support, we have a part. There's other independent Baptist churches of like mind that join. We join with them. If they send their missionaries our way, then we take on their missionary for a certain amount each month to give them. And we send our missionaries out to churches, and they do likewise. And there's safety in that, because if a missionary has, if he has 80 or 100 churches that will be supporting them on a monthly basis, then he has not only monetary support from 100 churches, but he has prayer support from 100 churches. And then if he has a problem on the field and has some extra expenses and he needs some help, then he can contact 100 churches who may be able to help him a little bit towards the problems that he has. If a missionary was on the field and he had 3 churches supporting him, or 1 church supporting him, and that all of his funds came in there, if that church had a problem, an unforeseen problem, then he would have to come home, because his supply would be cut short, or cut to where he could not survive. So anyway, that's a little synopsis of this. The offering is based upon faith, which reason it's called faith promise, and it's given first, just as the tithe is given first. And it's a promise. It's a promise not to me. You're not promising me anything. You're not really promising the church. It's a promise between you and the Lord, and it's given a promise for a year. Now we break it down where you can give it. You can give it any way you want to give it. You can give it You can give it for a year, one offering for a year. You can give it. Most people we do it by the week. We get, normally get paid by the week. Some people get paid by the month. They like to do their offering by the month. Whatever way, you can do it by the day or the hour or the minute. Whatever you choose is okay. But we send an offering to missionaries the 20th of every month. There is a stack of envelopes that are mailed out that go to various places that scatter our mission money that we've promised to missionaries. We send them a monthly amount. And so that goes out on the 20th of every month. So you give it, and then it's sent out. And any excess that we would have, then we would look for mission projects that we can get involved in. A missionary has some expense that we try to help them with. So that's what any excess would be there for. So anyway, let's look in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 1 says, "Moreover, brethren," now Paul's writing. Who's he writing to? This is the Apostle Paul. He's writing to this church at Corinth. That's a church, a growing church, but it's a church that had some problem areas. He wrote a letter to them, his first letter. They had some issues, but now they're really maturing. And he says, "Moreover, brethren, we do you to witness of the grace of God bestowed on the churches of Macedonia." Now, who are the churches of Macedonia? Well, some of those churches are the church of Philippi, Thessalonica, Berea, Athens. Now, that's the region that Paul went into and preached the gospel, that on a world map you would see it called Macedonia. So Paul went there, and he gives an example of these churches. He says that in a great trial of affliction, the abundance of their joy and their deep poverty abounded unto the riches of their liberality. In other words, this church was in great trials of affliction. The early church, beginning at the church, remember the church at Jerusalem, and Jesus built the church, okay? And he established that church, and then it was empowered on the day of Pentecost. And then when Jesus was ascended into heaven and this early church was preaching the gospel was hated. It's always been hated. The death, burial, and resurrection of Christ has always had its enemies. Remember, even when Christ was resurrected, They hired those soldiers that paid them money to tell a lie, to say that his body was stolen away. So it was always a disputed fact whether the resurrection, well, Jesus kind of put that to rest among the disciples when he appeared to them after the resurrection. After he was resurrected, he appeared to them for 40 days. And the Bible records it in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. And by many infallible proofs, he showed himself that he was alive. He showed himself in his resurrected body. And over 500 people at one time saw him alive. So among the believers, they were willing to give their life for the resurrection. That's how much they believed in the resurrection. But the early church was persecuted and they were scattered. And so now the Apostle Paul, I believe Brother Mike, I believe he had a special heart for that because in some ways he was responsible for much of that persecution. Yeah. See, he thought that Christ was an imposter himself. And he believed that he was doing God's will. He thought he was doing the God of heaven's will by persecuting these that were following after this imposter Jesus Christ. But it changed one day when on the road to Damascus, when God, the Lord Jesus, appeared to him in a great light and spoke to Paul, and Paul got saved that day. And now he began to have this burden to get the gospel out himself. And so I believe he had a special heart for the problems that were at Jerusalem. I mean, people had scattered, people had lost their homes, and people had lost their jobs over the resurrection, over Christ. And so he began to raise money to send back to the persecuted church and to believers who were scattered in various places of the world, who were trying to survive after the crucifixion of Christ. So he says, he used now this Churches of Macedonia. He said, in all of their affliction and all their trials, they still have joy in the Lord, and they've given abundantly. He says, verse 3, for to their power, that means to their ability. You know, he says, I bear record, yea, and beyond their ability, beyond their power, they are willing themselves, praying us with much entreaty that we would receive the gift. I mean, they said, Paul said, this church, the churches over in Macedonia, they're contacting me and say, please receive our gift, receive our offerings. We want to help you in your missionary work. Please receive this. It says they were begging him to receive their funds to send relief to persecuted believers. And he says, and more than that, look in verse 5, and this they did not as we hoped, but they first gave their own selves to the Lord and to us by the will of God. Insomuch that we desired Titus that as he had begun, so he would also finish in you the same grace also. Now notice that the word grace, explanation as a gift, and it says, therefore, as ye abound in everything, in faith and utterance and knowledge and in all diligence, and in your love to us, so that ye abound in this grace also, in giving of this gift also. I speak not by commandment, but by occasion of the forwardness of others, and to prove the sincerity of your love. So the Apostle Paul was writing to these believers, and he was encouraging them because they had made a promise to give. Look at it in verse number 10. It says, and herein I give my advice, for this is expedient for you, who have begun before not only to do, but also to be forward a year ago. Now, so the context of this, they had made a promise to give money to the believers, especially the believers down in Jerusalem, who are an area who had been persecuted. And they had, when Paul had talked to them, they had been talked to about this offering that was being taken, and they were going to take a year to raise this offering. And so that's what he's talking about. He's writing them to remind them that a year ago they made a promise for an offering. So look at your first fill in the blank there. Number 1, the faith promise plan is set forth in 2 Corinthians 8 and 9. The Corinthian offering was to be collected in 1 year. I've looked there in verse 10. Also look in chapter 9, verse 1 says, for as touching the ministering to the saints, it is superfluous, that word meaning unnecessary, for me to write to you. In other words, you know the needs of the saints, the needs they have. But he realized he wasn't telling them anything new. He was just reminding them, he says, For I know the forwardness of your mind. He said, I know what you're really in your mind, what you want to do in your mind, for which I boast of you to them of Macedonia. He said, I know your heart. I know what you want to do. I know the promise that you made to give to these believers. You made that promise, and you're collecting that for a year. And he says, and I boasted of you to them of Macedonia. So he's went to Macedonia and says, hey, you've been sending offerings, but let me tell you, somebody else has been receiving an offering. Boy, these believers down in Corinth, they really have a burden for the gospel too, and they're taking up an offering. And he says, then he says in verse 2, the middle of that verse, for which I boast of you to them of Macedonia, that Achaia, which is the Corinth area, was ready a year ago, and your zeal hath provoked very many. In other words, a year previous, they had made that decision to start collecting this offering. He says, yet have I sent the brethren, lest our boasting of you should be in vain in this behalf. So he had sent Titus and 2 others there to remind them about this offering and to encourage them about collecting that offering, reminding them that a year would be up and that offering then would be sent to help the believers. So the faith promise plan, what we practiced for years, is we make a promise for 1 year. So we do this in March, the middle of March. And so when we come up to the faith promise, our year's almost up. So you made a promise. Many of you made a promise, a faith promise, and you made it a year ago almost now. And so if you're like me, today, well, in Sunday school I put in my tithe, but in the 11 o'clock service I always have a check for my faith promise. And so that's some way that I can remember how to do this. So I keep my faith promise card at home. Nobody knows what I give to faith promise. I put the card in. It was sent back to me. No record was kept in the church office or anywhere, but I have that card at home, the very one I filled out. I see it every week. I know exactly what I promised, and so I write a check. I try to write that check before I get to church, and then I put it in the offering basket on Sunday morning service. And to fulfill my faith promise that I made each week, that I promised each week, okay? Now, so that's what the faith promise is all about, and that's coming up to a close. So then this March, I'll make another commitment, as I hope you will, for the next year. Secondly, the second fill in the blank, and we'll keep this lesson for next week because obviously we're not going to get through it all. But number 2, the Corinthian offering was to help the struggling church in Jerusalem. And the Philippian church sent offerings to support the Apostle Paul in his missionary work. You find that in Philippians chapter 4, verses 15 and 16. So the Apostle Paul, he didn't put any pressures on any churches to support him, but he did appreciate their support. He most notably appreciated their prayer support. Paul said in time and time again, brethren, pray for us. And when missionaries come to our church, all these missionary families, we have 6 or 7 missionary families that will be with us for our conference. And they're going to come in and set up a display. And on that display, they're going to put a picture of themselves and their family and a little card, something like this. And what's it called? A prayer card. So they're coming here asking us for prayer. No missionaries ever come. Now, they may let us know their needs, but they're coming, first of all, for prayer support. And so the Apostle Paul wanted prayer support. He appreciated the monetary support because, that's how he could survive. Now, Paul was a tent maker, and sometimes if the offerings weren't that didn't come in, if to help sustain him, he would go to tent making for a while to keep himself on the mission field. And so many missionaries even do that, especially homebound missionaries that are starting in the States. In foreign countries, it's not the same. In foreign countries, most foreign countries do not allow a foreigner just to come in and work without their permission. They have to be doing something that the government will approve of. You just can't go there and say, well, I'm going to go there. I'm a skilled electrician. I'm going to go supplement my gospel preaching, my mission work by being an electrician. They're not going to allow that. Now, you might could go in and get a job as a teacher to teach English to some of their people, or teaching in a university or something, but it's very restricted. So missionaries, especially foreign missionaries, totally rely upon giving from America, from churches in America, to keep them on the field. Okay, number 3, the faith promise offering is over and above our tithes. In verse number 7, it's talked about as grace giving. The tithe is never talked about as grace giving. When the Bible talks about the tithe, it says the tithe is the Lord's. Remember, as a believer, everything we have belongs to God. Now, some people reject that thought. Well, I earned that money. Well, yeah, you earned that money, and I earned that money. But who gave you the breath? Who gave you the health? You know, who bought you with a price? You see, once we get saved, we're not our own anymore. We're bought with a price. And we become what the Bible calls stewards. A steward is someone who looks after what belongs to another. And so we're the stewards of God. All we have is His. Everything you have, your home, your car. Sometimes I talk to the Lord about that, and I say, Lord, you know, my car's having some problems. Your car's having some problems. You're going to have to help me out with this car. Huh? So it works both ways. It belongs to the Lord. I say, Lord, you're going to have to help me get this thing fixed. I say, Lord, your house looks like it needs some paint. And He'll say, well, you're the steward. You take care of it. Get busy. I'll give you the money to buy the paint. You go buy the paint and paint that thing up. I'm in the process of doing some of that, which is not my most favorite thing to do. But we all have to do stuff like that. We're stewards. And we give the tithe. We're commanded. It's a command. Upon the first day of the week, let every one of you lay by him in store. It's not talking to the people in the world. It's not talking about somebody who is unsaved. It's talking about to those of us who've been bought with a price. Those of us, He's given us eternal life. Wow. Would we ever begrudge wanting to give something to the Lord, returning back and being a good steward? I mean, just think of what He does for you. He gives you 100%, and He says, you give me 10% back, and you got 90% left. And then, you know, there is some needs around the world. Maybe you could take some of that 90% and give some more of that as a gift to get the gospel to the world. That's a pretty good deal. If you want to give me 100%, me give you, let me keep part of it and give you more back to you, that's a pretty good deal, right? He's the giver, and so we benefit by that. So the grace of giving and the mission offering, the faith promise offering, was a means where the churches, see, Paul was not supported just by one church. He was supported by several churches. And when he went into the places, those believers in that area supported his mission work as well. So that's the faith promise plan. The fourth thing there, and then I won't have you turn it over to the other side, but the faith promise offering is not normally designated to any one missionary, but these funds are distributed among the missionaries and projects determined by the church. Now, we've had our mission program going on now for many years. So, in 1965, I'm going to say, as a part of this church, which was Dayton Baptist Temple at this time, Pastor Fleming established a mission program. We started supporting, we'd probably already